I'd like to say we've saved the best for last, but we'll see how we go. So, when we talk about adoption in our conversation today, a little 5-minute cap on what it is. So, what is adoption? We're going to touch on what does it actually mean, how do we define it. A little bit of doom and gloom, I will pre-warn you. Some numbers in there that aren't too flattering, but they're important to the conversation. Light at the end of the tunnel. We're not going to take you down into the depths of despair and then not bring you back out. We're going to talk about some of the elements of consideration. And then I'm going to invite Tar up onto the stage, the amazing Tar that you all saw in the plenary, to talk a little bit about how Esri Australia is taking a different approach to adoption and how we support our clients through the journey of digital transformation. And there's 3 things at the end that I'd like you to take away from today. If you take those away, then I'm happy, and Brisbane is the best city that we've been to. Okay, so let's jump in. Adoption. So I don't really know what you think about when you hear the word adoption, but it's used a lot. It describes a lot of different things, it means a whole lot of different things, and it's measured a whole lot of different ways. Sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's not, but more often than not, we didn't really measure adoption, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. And so today I'm here to suggest that it's because we haven't been thinking about adoption in the right way or talking about adoption in the right way. And because of that, we struggle to get the right level of funding and executive buy-in. So when we talk about adoption, what are we talking about? Well, you can Google a simple definition and it will describe it as the action of choosing to take up or use something. And the word choosing is key here. So we've all heard about the system that people put in, they didn't use it, or they used it because they had to, or they used it in a completely different way to what it was designed to be used. I think everybody's got a story like this. Can I have a quick show of hands? If you've had might have even been a GIS implementation that didn't quite go the right way. We've all heard the war stories. And I'm here to suggest in part it's because of poor implementation rather than strategy. So the strategic direction was right, but the way that it was implemented was not necessarily aligned. And because not all adoption programs are created equal, and it's effective adoption that Tara and I want to talk about today. So you may have heard of the Technology Services Institute, or Technology Services Industry Association, They talk about a maturity spectrum for adoption, which runs from low to high through to effective. And when they talk about a low maturity type adoption, they talk about measuring things like individuals, roles, clicks, memory, capacity, etc. They progress along the spectrum to talk about things like accuracy, validity, completeness, products, modules, etc. But then they move on to talk about effective adoption. And effective adoption really encompasses 2 things, efficiency and effectiveness. And when we're talking about effective adoption, we're talking about what has the impact been on the business objectives that the original strategic intent was designed to move the business forward on. And how has that driven efficiency in terms of dollars, time, driving revenue, creating opportunity, etc. And so they talk about the effectiveness of adoption in these measures. So understanding that the adoption program that you've been responsible for at a business level, what does that mean? So statements like, has the adoption of technology reduced the time taken to deliver service A? Has it created a greater capacity to drive revenue? Has it helped me engage with my community more in order to successfully compete in the healthcare sector, for example? So who talks about their adoption programs like that? Show of hands? Anyone use that kind of language? Look at those kind of measures? Not too many. And so I'm going to suggest that that's some of the work that we have to do, and here's why. So these numbers startle me a bit. McKinsey and TSIA talk about these numbers, which reference that for every dollar spent on a new strategy, so a new initiative, a new system, a new line of service, it's not uncommon for up to 70 cents in the dollar to be lost through poor execution, poor implementation. 70% of your investment lost through poor implementation. I just find that astounding when we think about the fact that our organisations, our departments are all stretched for resources. We have to make sure that we're driving the best outcomes that we can. We still have numbers like this in the marketplace. And the key driver of failed execution? Poor adoption. The Harvard Business Review tells us that this investment leakage, as I like to call it, happens around 50% of the time. That's up to 50% of projects fail to meet expected outcomes. So they may not move all the way to the 70 cents in the dollar lost, but they're on the journey. And I just find that astounding. And we have to think differently about why that is the case. So that was a little bit of the doom and gloom on the numbers side. But on a less theoretical note, and a little closer to home, another reason that I know we've got some work to do in the adoption space is because we asked you, our clients. So about 24 months ago now, and progressing over the last couple of years, we've done a lot of client research. We spoke to a lot of our clients. We wanted to know, what was your GIS journey like? How did you define it? How did you experience it? What were the outcomes from it? So we did a lot of research and it gave us a lot of insights, and I heard quotes like, I had to performance manage my team onto the new system or the new capability. We had a lot of sad faces, frustrated emojis, and for very visual people, this jumped off the page at them. And this is where I'm going to let you in on a little secret. As Esri Australia's Chief Client Officer, I took a step back from that, and I was quite alarmed. So I went deeper into the research, and when I looked at it, what was actually telling me is that it wasn't about our relationship with you, but it was you telling us that adoption is just really, really hard. It's hard for everybody that tries to undertake digital transformation and go on the journey. And so for us, it was about how do we partner with you differently or offer different support to help you on that journey? Because in the spirit of transparency, if you're spending that dollar with Esri Australia, I don't want you to be on that 70-cent journey. I want your business outcomes realised. So, the doom and gloom, where does the story leave us? Well, it actually leaves us with a really, really good news story. Because the first thing was recognising that we had to think about this differently, we had to think about the journey differently, and how could we support you differently. So, the next question is, how do we think about that differently? What does that actually mean? So if you think about an implementation, there's 4 core elements. You've got your technology, you've got data, processes, people. Generally, most things in an implementation phase fit into one of these buckets. So most of the time we get the technology piece. We spend a lot of time thinking about it, a lot of time researching it, doing the legwork. Generally, we can put a big tick against that. The data, most of the time, goes with the technology. We spend quite a bit of time about that. We've got some work to do on data governance, but we're having a lot of conversation and we recognise that it's really important. Processes, sometimes we cover them off, but I do think we've got some work to do here, recognising the end-to-end process that the change will drive through our business, and then what does that mean in terms of the business outcomes. But, you guessed it, so often more than not, it's the people element that we either forget, delay, or don't think about at the start of the conversation. And, as I talked about earlier, it is the critical piece of the puzzle in terms of making sure that we're not on that journey in terms of poor implementation and execution. But why is that the case? Why do we fail to achieve the level of investment and buy-in required when all of the statistics, the science, and just common sense tell us that our people are the most single important element of that change? It's great to have capable systems, right data, people, processes, but if you don't have your people engaged and actively choosing to use that system, where does that leave us? And I think there's 3 big reasons why, and this is based not only on my experience, but the experience of TSIA, Harvard Business Review, PMI, and many others. So let's take a little bit of a look at that. The big three. We don't use the right language. Who thinks there's a difference between training and adoption? Those words, hands up. Okay, pretty good. Not as high in Sydney and Melbourne. Time to upskill, reduce time to value. Difference in those? Okay, a little bit less. So I would categorically argue that there is a difference between those language sets. And as an executive, I have the responsibility to ensure that we don't find ourselves in that 70 cents category if we're undertaking a change initiative in Esri Australia. So when I hear adoption instead of training, it aligns the investment I'm going to make in my people to the outcome of my initiative. I'm taking steps to avoid that failure and the wasted 70-cent journey. So don't get me wrong, training is absolutely a necessary part of a comprehensive adoption program, but it doesn't anchor or centre my conversation around outcomes and return on investment at a business impact level. And to take one step further, it's actually language that describes a cost rather than an outcome. So they're very important differences. Whereas the word adoption sets a very different context. Straight away, I've got a decision-making framework, and the importance of my investment in adoption-based services is focused on value creation, driving my return on investment. So we need to change the language that we've traditionally used around training and learning to be about adoption and outcomes. And that aligns to, I'm sure, what you've heard a lot of the others speak about today, including Fanny, who was on stage just before me. The second one, we don't put the right measures in place. And I alluded to this at the start of the presentation about TSIA's measurement metric. So I was recently interviewing for a change manager position at Esri Australia, and all of the candidates that I'd interviewed had been working on large organisational-wide projects. And they all commented that one of the most common pitfalls by organisations is that there isn't enough emphasis on benchmarking the metrics at the start of the program, the middle of the program, and the end of the program, and benchmarking at a business impact level. So for an adoption program, if you think back to that model, it's not talking about people, roles, clicks, modules. It's talking about how have I made that process more efficient in terms of time? How have I created greater capacity to deliver a service or revenue? So we're changing the way we actually measure the outcome of the program from a cost input to value created. And that's exactly how an executive will measure the impact of a program that you put in place. 3, we don't have the conversation early enough. And to go back to those numbers that we heard on our doom and gloom story, it's just not a luxury that we can afford. I've heard things like, let's cover that off later, once we've signed off the project, I'll put an allocation aside and we'll work it out. You just cannot afford that. The conversation must start early. It must be aligned to the project or the change. And you must take everybody on that journey early. Because with people being the single largest variable factor in the success of your transformation, you can't leave it as an afterthought. You can't design it during the project. You have to be thinking about it at the start, and you have to have your executive buy in at the start of that conversation as well. So how do we change this? Well, we've been thinking about a few things, and that was informed by our research and talking to our clients. So the first is adoption programs that are just in time, not just in case. So what do I mean by that? I'm talking about things like micro-adoption services, which are smaller engagements delivered at a time when team members need them, when they're trying to execute something in a workflow and they reach a barrier. Secondly, adoption programs which are laser focused, not broad brush. So if you're looking at your change from a process perspective and a business outcome perspective, you will understand the biggest challenges for your people in that change. Focus your resources, your time, your energy on the most impactful points of change. Make it laser focused, not broad brush. And then thirdly, programs which are data driven. And when Tara comes up onto the stage, she's going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment and what that means. But it is about using the data that our people give us, that the technology providers give you, that the marketplace will inform you with, and saying, how do I make sure I'm honing in on the right thing? So your data will enable you to become laser focused and in turn more successful. So I'm going to invite Tara up on stage to talk a little bit about how we've applied what you've just heard, I guess, in a much more practical sense when we looked at the journey from Map to Pro. Thanks, Tara.
Home state. It's always so great to come here because then everyone claps. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Kate. And I think the conversation that we're having, or that we're starting to have today, is really important. And the purpose of us starting to talk about our programs that we're starting to build out is to equip you and enable you guys to have these conversations a lot earlier within your businesses. Now, I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with a tiny little technological change in desktop, so moving from ArcMap to ArcGIS Pro. Now, a few of our clients have been making this change, but we have noticed that it hasn't been going as quickly and as smoothly as we'd like. So we'll do a couple of live polls while I speak, if that's okay with you guys. So I do encourage you to engage. How many of you are existing ArcMap users? I'm ashamed to put my hand up. How many of you, please keep your hands up. How many of you, keep your hand up if you have started to migrate or start to play around with ArcGIS Pro? Oh. Heart is broken. Of those, if you keep your hands up, if you started to play with ArcGIS Pro, how many of you have had a pleasant experience? One. And I've included myself as someone who's put my hand down. And that shows me that there's a problem. So what we've seen and what we've done is start to put together something based on your interactions, your engagements, and your feedback. So thinking about adoption and everything that Kate has talked about today, including dollar value, cost, the difference in language, we've started applying all of these things into putting together programs and passports. So passports, just like the travel document you have access to, gives you and enables you to have access to all types of information. So it's curated content and documentation and artifacts that enable you to quickly and easily get up and running with ArcGIS Pro. Now, it dawned on us that we needed to create these so that you guys could have access. But like Kate said beforehand, we have to be data-driven. It was this morning when Gary was talking, he said, the things that we measure are things that we can actually do something about. Now, what we want to do, of course, is avoid these, sad faces. So we thought, let's put something together that'll get people onto a positive journey in engaging with this new technology and this shift. So, as all technologists do, and as a GIS nerd, we got our data geek on. Now, we want to be focused and to be data-driven. Hands up again if you've ever submitted a support request with Esri Australia, particularly around desktop and particularly around ArcGIS Pro. Me included too. So what we've been doing is looking at data. Now, a little bit of history, if you're not aware, ArcGIS Pro was introduced back in 2016 at version 1.0 in January. We moved across to version 1.4 in January of 2017. So between January of 2017, when ArcGIS Pro at version 1.4 became the flagship desktop product, up until now, and we're now at version 2.4, that's 3 years of data that we've been collecting. 3 years of support tickets, 3 years of webinars, 3 years of conference feedback. And we've been looking at everything that you guys have been telling us. We created some real-time dashboards that focused on Map to Pro, and the results were pretty astounding. A lot of information that came through was people were excited to know more about the product, but they didn't know where to go to get the right information and how to get them up and running. So a lot of people just gave up. And something really interesting that Brian Bullman said this morning, he said, if you go to a brand new product, you can't find a button, you can't click on somewhere, it goes straight into the too hard basket. So no one's interested in engaging and adopting that new technology. So, Map to Pro, how are we getting there? Well, we started to read through your information, and we've come up with a list of the top 5 pro tips, things that you need to know, or a lot of pain points that people have told us about, and we're focusing our passports to address these top 5 things. Now, what I want to focus on here is not just talking technology, but also talking strategy. If I use technology, I need to be able to relate the technology I'm using to an executive like Kate and talk more about strategy. It's great for me to know that ArcGIS Pro has this dope new functionality that talks about changing or including spell check. But what does that mean for Kate? She'll be like, hey, Ta, that's dope, but what does that mean for me? Well, Kate, it means that I don't have to go and have my work double-checked by somebody else. It means I already have pre-approved words and information within my map, so when I export it, I'm shaving off 10 or 15 or up to half an hour of someone else's time checking that. So some of these top 5 things include user interface. From a technology perspective, some people wanted to know, where are the new buttons? Where am I going to find my analysis tools? What's changed? What are panes and what are views? From a strategic view, this means that I'm spending less time trying to find buttons and more time doing the work that Pro is designed for me to do. In terms of migrating existing work, the most important part about any kind of migration with technology, what are my existing map documents, my templates, my fonts, my styles? How do I then get this into this new product so I can get up and running quickly and so that I can start to use industry and technology best practice to get where I need to get to quickly and easily? Sharing workflows. If anyone isn't aware, ArcGIS Pro is designed to work well and integrate seamlessly with WebGIS. So what does that mean for me? Well, it means that if we have a portal or ArcGIS Online set up, I can quickly and easily share my maps and my views as well as layouts to my organization's portal. From a strategic view, what does that mean? It means we can quickly and easily engage with our internal and external community. So I don't have to worry about sending something somewhere else and having it double-checked. Straight to our portal, we have QA, QC in place, and then it's up and running live on our site for our community to engage with. Editing in Pro. As a lot of power users would know, you want to be able to quickly and easily change or update the data in your maps. From a technology perspective, what's changed? I'm used to having to select a specific workspace in ArcMap before I start to edit. But in Pro, editing is turned on by default. That means it's reduced time having to save or access workspaces and start new sessions. So that means it's saving time, which is saving our business money. And finally, with geoprocessing in ArcGIS Pro. Now, as we know, with any kind of technological change, some functionalities do become redundant, but that makes way for new processes for us to uptake. So with Geoprocessing Pro, we want to focus on getting the technology up to a place, as well as your information and understanding, to a place where you know which tools are no longer available in ArcGIS Pro when you're migrating from ArcMap. But it also means we'll also show you how to put in industry and technology best practice. So moving away from one-on-one tasks to using tasks in ArcGIS Pro. So you set up essentially what seems like a simple script to be able to run through and add your individual data. You then share this specific task with other individuals within your organization. They plug in their data, and automatically it takes them through step by step a specific function or process to get to the end result. Again, that's saving me money, and it means I'm teaching my individuals or taking away that harder learning task from them having to figure out how to get to an end process. So these are the top 5 things that you guys have told us that you want to know about ArcGIS Pro. And this is really how we're starting to structure our passports to enable you guys as users, as well as the GIS community, to access the right information at the right time. Well, now I hand back to Kate, who's going to wrap up with a couple of things and takeaways for us.
Thanks, Ta. So I guess that's more of a really practical approach about how we're trying to curate the huge amount of data that's out there for you to have a passport that's laser focused to enable you to make the transition as quickly and as easily as you can so that you're driving the bigger business impact that your organization intended with the change in technology. So if you leave today with 3 things, here they are, and I'm going to go really quickly because Andy's wrapping me up. Change your language. You have to change your language from being around cost to being about value creation. You have to measure what matters, and we've heard that all throughout today. We heard it from Gary in the plenary and all along the line. Measure what matters. and that's about the business impact and how your adoption program aligns to that. And start the conversation early. A successful adoption program is developed in parallel to the planning that you do around the change that you're going to make. And again, you've heard that throughout today. It's not something with the numbers that you saw that you can afford to wait. So they're our top 3 things that we'd like to hope that you take away from today. And thank you very much for your attention.